Welcome to this MOOC session, which is titled Crafting a Civil Society in China. This is part of the MOOC series Introduction to Chinese Politics and Society and is part of the ReConnect China project. My name is Bart Dessein and I am a senior full professor at Ghent University's Chinese Studies program. What I will do with you today is sketch the crafting of a civil society in China. And so it is, of course, first necessary that I define civil society. In today's lecture, I define civil society as the public domain in which different groups, different social groups, different political groups of society can meet, discuss, debate, and can sometimes not, be helped by institutions of civil society, such as unions, to argue for their rights, and to also in this way have leeway in having access to social and or political mobility. If we want to get back to the history of this crafting of a civil society in China, it is necessary that we look into the political and the philosophical background of traditional Chinese culture. And that means that we have to go to Confucianism and legalism. In Confucianism and in legalism, we find ideas about how a civil society should be organized. In Confucianism, we basically have the distinction between two groups of people. On the one hand, we have, as I have put here on the slide, the Shang, and on the other hand, we have the Xiao, which are respectively synonymous for the Junzi and the Xiaoren. The Junzi is the ideal Confucian type, and this is, in practice, let's say, the functionaries, so the higher echelons of Chinese society. The Xiaoren are all the other groups of people. Legalism, in the legalist philosophy, we have a more strict division between four groups, social groups of people. We have the Shi, which basically is similar to the Junzi, so that means the functionaries of society. We have the Nun, these are the farmers. We have the Kung, the craftsmen, and we have the Shang, these are the merchants. We do see that in the Han dynasty, that is a dynasty that has basically given its name to Han China, the dynasty also to which the people of contemporary China, the Han people, still refer. This was the first Confucian, so-called Confucian dynasty of the Chinese history. I say so-called Confucian because if we see in practice, this Confucianism of the Han dynasty had also a very important legalist component in it. And this is what I will now try to explain and also look at the ramifications of this fusion of legalist and Confucian concepts. This is probably one of the most famous sayings we find in the Luenyu. This is the book written by later disciples of the master of Confucianism, Confucius. And there we read, the master said, cultivated people harmonize, they do not equalize. Ordinary men equalize, they do not harmonize. What we see here, and it's already important, I would say I can make a big jump to contemporary China, where also the idea of a harmonious society and a harmonious world is part of the contemporary rhetorics of Chinese politics. And the importance here that this is a value judgment. Value judgment that sees the Junzi, the cultivated people, as more morally refined. They can behave in such a way that they do not incite opposition, that they do not incite contradictions, so harmonize society as being different from the lower people, the Xiaoren, I have already mentioned. Not only does Confucianism see a moral difference between the higher and the lower classes of the people, but Confucianism and Confucius is at least attributed with also seeing an intellectual difference. this intellectual difference will also be important in the legalist concept. In the Lunny, once again, we read the master said, the common people can be made to follow the Confucian way, but they cannot be made to understand it. So from this, it's clear that there is indeed a different appreciation with respect to knowledgeability, so an intellectual difference, to the extent that the common people can be made to follow the Confucian way, which in itself already has some degree of a coercive force. Coercive force of the Junzi, of course, vis-à-vis the common people. In Mengzi, who in political philosophy in China only became important, let's say, in the somewhat roughly the 10th century, but also in Mengzi, we find this kind of a qualification of the different groups of people. Mengzi, Mencius in his Latinized form, is said to have said that it is characteristic for the multitude that they do not realize what it is they practice, that they do not examine what they repeatedly do, and that they do not understand the path they follow for their lives. So here we see this qualification, a different qualification of intellectual possibilities of the higher and the lower classes. And with this I come to Junzi. Junzi, who is a somewhat later Confucian, historically speaking, compared to Confucius and Mencius, but who is very much importantly for the topic of today, who is very much influenced by legalist thinking. And Junzi says to consider following customary usages as goodness, to consider wealth and material possessions as the greatest treasure, and to consider nurturing one's life as the highest way is the virtue of the common people. It means that the common people basically are concerned with their material possessions and wealth, not with higher moral standards. Their virtue, their morality consists of maintaining their livelihood. I will come to that a little bit later. Because this is the case, Junzi once again says, what is it that makes a man human? I say that it lies in his ability to draw boundaries. Of such boundaries, none is more important than that between social classes. Of the instruments for distinguishing social classes, none is more important than the ritual principles. This is a statement with very important ramifications. I have already mentioned the four groups in society according to legalistic thinking, and according to Junzi, these four groups have to be strictly divided, and the behavior within these groups and among mutually these groups has to be guided by ritual principles. How is that to be explained? Well, it has to do with the previous quotation I have given of Junzi. Common people are only concerned with maintenance of their own life. And this is related to the fact that we can see traditional China as a peasant society. A peasant who needs funds, one could say, for three important purposes in life. The first being the maintenance of his own livelihood and of his kinship. The second being the fact that in a coercive position of the Junzi, as I already mentioned, the peasant has to pay taxes to the to the higher ups. And the third element is the ritual expenditures he has to do. Ritual expenditures which make him part of a social group. And if he does not conform to the rituals, the ritual principles, then of course that peasant and his kinship would alienate themselves from the social group to which they belong, a social group which is strictly ruled by ritual principles in a strict social division. Strict social division that also makes it impossible that there is a upward social mobility. This already points to it that in the traditional Confucian legalist society, there is not such a thing as what I just defined, a civil society as a public sphere, a public domain in which different social groups can mutually converse with each other, influence each other, come to new positions, and also work for, supported by institutions, work for their own social and political mobility. This is morally justified in Confucian thinking, and we can see this from this statement by Mengzi. There are those who use their minds, and there are those who use their physical strength. Those who use their minds rule, those who use their physical strength are ruled, or how indeed the coercive element I have pointed out already is morally justified. Junze, once again, says that this social division, this strict social division with, that is guided by ritual principles, will cause anyone born to the world to consider the long view of things and think of the consequences, thereby protecting a myriad of generations. This is in some sense an interpretation of a harmonious society. A harmonious society is where everyone is considering the consequences in the long run of his or her actions and does not incite contradiction or controversy among the fellow citizens or the fellow members of society. This leads to it, as I said, practically the absence of a social or civil society, that political mobility in China could only traditionally take a non-institutionalized form. Before I go into that a little bit further, I should point out that in Chinese society, there also is something as a specific relation between orthodoxy and orthopraxy. The orthodoxy is the Confucian legalist view of society I have just outlined. There is, however, also, and this particularly applies to the gentry, to the junzi, to the rulers of society, the functionaries, there's also something as an orthopraxy. That means, and we do know that from history, that some of the functionaries, even sometimes the emperor, were in their personal belief and their personal life adherents of Taoism or of some form of a Buddhist group. This was perfectly acceptable, and one could say, we have also polemical text in this context, that there was indeed a possibility to have within the group of the functionaries to have upward social mobility. So, and in that sense, one can say that for this little group of the elites, which have been calculated as something of 4 to 6% of the total Chinese population, there was some kind of a civil society. Not so, of course, once again, because of the strict ritualized social divisions in the legalist Confucian system, this was not the case for the peasants. And in the case that there was shortage, this meant that the peasant, for him, of course, the sustenance of his life and his kinship was most important. Second most important was the social cohesion, the rituals he has to do, she has to do in order to belong to a specific social group. And in the case of crisis, the least important was loyalty to the junzi, and so the paying of taxes. And this has resulted in it that in severe cases of economic crisis, we did have peasant revolts. Peasant revolts, I have given here a few examples. It's not an exhaustive list, but you can see that throughout Chinese history, every now and then there indeed was such a peasant revolt. The peasants revolting against the local or the central government. When the revolt was successful, well, the economic basis of society and the social basis of society did not change. So there was a new dynasty which was characterized in the same way as the one that was just toppled, and again, no civil society developed. Apart from the peasant revolt, we also have secret societies. Secret societies were either Buddhist or Taoist connected, and were also, one could say, a kind of an ersatz social group in times of big crisis. Peasants indeed did align with a secret society that had also, more than once in Chinese history, has toppled an existing dynasty, but again with the same result. The economic basis did not change. So once again, no civil society as such, in the way I defined it, did develop. This changes importantly starting, let's say, in the middle of the 19th century, when indeed political alternatives are brought into China through the contact of China with the Western world. Again, this list I have here is not exhaustive, but it has some interesting examples. For instance, we here have the Taiping Tianguo Qi, so the Taiping Rebellion, as it is often called, that proposed a kind of a Christian socialist ideology of redistribution of the wealth from the rich to the poor, equality of man and wife, and things like that. We also have the 100 Days movement, which was a movement inspired also by ideas of a constitutional monarchy. We also have the establishment of the first actual political parties, and the first being the Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, later followed by a series of other political parties, anarchist groups, and so on, who all had a political alternative. And indeed, we see that it is gradually starting from the middle of the 19th century, that when we turn into the 20th century, that we indeed also have, for the first, it was not a success, one can say, democratically, or the aftermath was not so successful from a democratic point of view, but we do see indeed that we have free elections in the early 20th century. We do see that in the same period we have the establishment of unions that are supporting the demands of the workers. We do have strikes that underscore the demands of the workers, and so on. And so one can say that from this transition from the Confucian dynastic period to the Republic of China, which was then founded in 1911, 1912, that indeed we have at that moment, for the very first time, inspired by Western alternatives, the development, the gradual development of a civil society. 1949, after the civil war between the communist troops and the Kuomintang troops, the remnants of the Imperial Army. Then, of course, in 1949, we have the establishment of the PRC, which again has a very important impact on the further development of this embryonic civil society. But this will be the topic of one of my colleagues in one of the follow-ups in this series on the introduction to political and social situation in China. I thank you for your attention.